She stood in court, her future on the line. The choice? Tear down her vineyard's fence or face ruin. Just as all hope seemed lost, her lawyer pulled off the impossible. What happened next will shock you. But let's start at the beginning. Sarah Mitchell had always prided herself on her peaceful suburban life, nestled in a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever seemed out of place. But that spring morning, as the sun bathed her vineyard in golden light, everything changed. A group of HOA officers appeared unannounced, their presence a stark contrast to the serenity she had come to expect. They delivered an official order. The fence around her vineyard had to be torn down. The wooden structure, which had stood proudly for over a decade, was now considered a violation of community guidelines. Her initial reaction was disbelief. How could something so simple, a fence, spark such a confrontation? The HOA had always been a nuisance, enforcing trivial rules that irritated the residents. But this felt personal. The fence wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a labor of love, built to protect the delicate vines and preserve the vineyard that had been in her family for generations. To her, it was a symbol of heritage, a testament to her passion. But to the HOA, it was an eyesore, an obstruction to the idealized community aesthetic they had worked so hard to cultivate. With a sharp inhale, Sarah attempted to reason with them, explaining the significance of the fence. She tried to make them understand that it wasn't just a structure, but a part of her family's legacy. Yet they were unmoved. The HOA had their rules, and they were unyielding. Her only options were to remove the fence or face heavy fines that would cripple her financially. Standing there with the officers' cold stares and the weight of their words sinking in, Sarah felt small, insignificant, a mere pawn in a system that valued uniformity over individuality. The vineyard, which had once been a place of peace, now felt like a battleground. But this wouldn't be the end. Sarah refused to let her family's history be erased by petty bureaucracy. What she didn't know yet was that this would ignite a struggle that would not only change her life, but also challenge the very foundation of the community she thought she knew. The fight had just begun. Outraged and determined to fight back, Sarah Mitchell knew she couldn't face the HOA alone. She needed someone who understood the law, someone who could take on this corporate-like behemoth that was trying to dictate her life. Enter Alex Reed, a seasoned attorney known for taking on the Goliaths of the world and winning. He was a no-nonsense lawyer with a sharp mind and a reputation for getting things done, no matter how tough the opponent. Together, Sarah and Alex combed through the HOA's own rules and regulations with meticulous attention to detail. They pored over every line, every clause, until something remarkable caught their eye. Her fence had never been a problem before. It had been part of the landscape for years, and during the last routine inspection, the HOA had even signed off on it. The inconsistency of the situation was striking. How could something that had been accepted for so long suddenly become an issue? But it didn't stop there. Digging deeper, Alex uncovered a crucial piece of information. A clause buried in the HOA's guidelines that prohibited the enforcement of any rules that were not explicitly stated in the neighborhood charter. And this was the key, because the HOA had not updated its guidelines in years, leaving them vulnerable to legal challenges. This wasn't just about Sarah's fence anymore. It was about the HOA's failure to follow their own rules, a failure that exposed their abuse of power. The more they uncovered, the more Sarah's determination grew. What had started as a dispute over a fence was now a battle against an outdated, poorly managed system that had lost sight of fairness. This wasn't just about protecting her property. It was about standing up to an institution that had overstepped its bounds and abused its authority. The stage was set. The courtroom awaited. Sarah, with Alex by her side, was ready to take on the HOA's arrogance and hold them accountable for their actions. The HOA, however, was confident they would win. They dismissed the case as nothing more than a nuisance, believing that their power and influence would see them through. But they had underestimated Sarah's resolve. She wasn't going to let them get away with it. This fight wasn't just about a fence, it was about taking back control. And Sarah was ready to do whatever it took to make sure she came out on top. The day of the trial arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Sarah sat upright, her eyes fixed ahead, her resolve unshakable. The room was silent, except for the occasional rustling of papers and the low murmur of spectators. This was more than just a legal battle. It was the culmination of everything Sarah had fought for in the past few weeks. Her lawyer, Alex Reed, stood at the podium, presenting the case with precision, his voice clear and unwavering. Opposing them was Jonathan Ellis, the HOA's slick lawyer, who tried to paint Sarah as a troublemaker, someone who didn't belong, someone who was disrupting the peace. He argued that the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood was at risk, portraying Sarah as the outlier in a community that cherished its uniformity. He raised his voice, trying to dominate the room, but his arguments were weak, relying on vague generalizations about community harmony and the supposed dangers of nonconformity. But Sarah's team wasn't intimidated. They had come prepared. Alex carefully presented the evidence, documents showing the HOA's failure to keep their rules updated, photographs of the fence that clearly aligned with the original design of the neighborhood, and statements from neighbors who all spoke in favor of Sarah's right to maintain her property as she saw fit. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. The atmosphere shifted when Ellis attempted to argue that the fence was an eyesore, a violation of the neighborhood's visual harmony. But Alex, quick on his feet, fired back with a devastating counterpoint. The HOA had approved similar structures in the past without hesitation, showing clear bias and inconsistency in their enforcement. It was a knockout argument. Ellis's case was crumbling. Judge Carol Winters, a no-nonsense figure, had been quietly observing the proceedings. Her sharp eyes flicked between the two sides, and it was clear she wasn't impressed by the HOA's lack of coherent evidence. As Ellis stammered through his defense, the judge leaned forward, her voice cutting through the air. "Mr. Ellis, I'm still waiting for you to justify the HOA's actions. If you cannot present a solid argument, I'll have to rule in favor of the defense." The tension in the room escalated. Ellis paused, clearly rattled. Sarah felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just a fight for her fence anymore. It was a battle against an unjust system, and the tide was beginning to turn in her favor. The courtroom was silent as Judge Winters delivered her verdict. She ruled in favor of Sarah Mitchell, declaring that the HOA had violated its own rules by enforcing outdated and inconsistent guidelines. The decision was a blow to the HOA, whose power over the community had been reduced. Sarah stood tall as the judge's gavel struck, signaling the end of a long and exhausting battle. She had won, not just for herself, but for every neighbor who had felt powerless under the HOA's oppressive regime. The fence that had started it all remained standing, a symbol of resistance against unfair authority. The HOA was ordered to pay damages for the stress and legal costs Sarah had incurred. More importantly, they were mandated to revise their outdated guidelines, giving residents more control over their own property. As Sarah walked out of the courthouse, her neighbors greeted her with applause. It wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for the entire community. The battle had been long and hard, but justice had finally prevailed. The HOA had learned a valuable lesson. Underestimate the power of one person who's willing to fight back, and the system will eventually crumble.